Well, I'm going to talk about dual system theories, and I want to discuss some problems they face and the best way to respond to them. And in the course of this, I shall try to get to what I see as the heart of the dual system distinction. Dual system theories, as I use the term, contrast with dual process theories. Dual process theories posit two different mental processes by which a response to a problem can be generated. Usually one of these processes is described as fast, automatic, non-conscious, effortless, and highly contextualized, and the other as slow, controlled, conscious, effortful, and abstract. The fast process is thought of as a quick and dirty one that relies on heuristics or associations, and it generates intuitive responses that are often biased in various ways. The slow process, on the other hand, is thought of as rule-governed and analytic, and it generates responses that respect the rules of logic and other normative systems, such as decision theory. Theories of this kind were developed during the 1980s and 1990s in various areas of psychology, in the study of reasoning, judgment and decision-making, and social cognition. Now, dual system theories are more ambitious. They try to synthesize different dual process distinctions by attributing the fast and slow processes to two different multi-purpose mental systems, usually labelled System 1 and System 2. Dual system theories also typically add further features to the descriptions of the two systems, such as difference of evolutionary age, heritability, and malleability. The fast system is typically described as being evolutionarily old, as displaying low variation between individuals, and as being relatively inflexible, whereas the slow system is thought of as evolutionarily late, distinctively human in fact, exhibiting high individual variation and being modifiable through training and cultural influences. Dual system theories like this emerged in the late 1990s. They were proposed by Jonathan Evans and David Over in their 1996 book Rationality and Reasoning, by Stephen Sloman in a well-known 1996 paper, and by Keith Frankish, both in his papers with Richard West and in his 1999 book Who is Rational, as well as later works. Now, broadly speaking, there are three types of evidence that support dual system theories. I'm drawing here on a recent summary by Evans and Stanovich. First, experimental manipulations. We can use experimental techniques such as time pressure, dual task methodologies, and explicit instruction to evoke different responses from subjects on reasoning tasks. We can either force them to produce a quick and dirty biased response, or give them time and motivation to produce a more effortful, normative response. And what's significant is that cognitive load systematically produces responses that are biased in certain ways, rather than just random responses. And that suggests that it's not just making the task harder, but that it's forcing a default to a different system that operates on different principles. Second, there's neuroscientific evidence. Neuroimaging studies by Matthew Lieberman, among others, suggest that different brain regions are differentially associated with non-conscious, intuitive, emotional responding, as opposed to conscious, rational, reflective responses. And third, there's work on individual differences. As Keith Frankish has shown, there are negative correlations between intelligence and responses that manifest biases or simple heuristics. And there's a positive correlation between intelligence and normative responses. But, and this is the important point, only where these require override of a heuristic-based response. Where the heuristic response and the normative one coincide, then the correlation with intelligence disappears, the positive correlation with intelligence disappears. And this again suggests that we're dealing with two systems, one that's heuristic-based and has low variability, and another that's rule-based and has high variability. Well, dual system theories have become quite popular in the past decade, and they're attracting attention in other disciplines, such as my own discipline, philosophy, and also in the popular press, especially after recent popular science books on the topic by Jonathan Evans, Keith Frankish, and Daniel Kahneman. However, they've also been criticised, in particular in a 2009 paper by Gideon Keron and Yakov Schul, and in a 2011 paper by Ari Kuklenski and Gerd Gigerenzer. And I'll mention some of these objections briefly. One problem is that dual system theories are somewhat vague, both as to what a system is and as to what features the two systems are supposed to have. What level of analysis is dual system talk pitched at? The neurological level, the functional level? And how are the two systems defined? There are multiple labels for the two systems in the literature and various different characterizations of them. And critics also argue that talk of dual systems has some implausible consequences. I'll mention some of these. First, it suggests that the two systems are unified and that there are no further divisions within each system. Second, it suggests that processing differences are dichotomous rather than continuous. Any given cognitive process belongs to one system or the other, and it's therefore either fast or slow, automatic or controlled, and so on. These features can't come in degrees. Third, it suggests that the dichotomies align. There aren't any hybrid processors that mix and match properties. For example, there are no processors that are slow and associative, or fast and rule-governed. Fourth, it suggests that the two systems are independent, that they're isolable and self-contained, and that there's no transfer of tasks between them. Fifth, it suggests that the two systems have discrete neural bases, that they depend on distinct structures in the brain. And all of these claims are very strong, and the critics say they go far beyond anything that's warranted by the current evidence. Okay, well, in a recent paper, two leading dual system theorists, Jonathan Evans and Keith Frankish, have collaborated to reply to some of these criticisms. This is a paper that's not out yet. It's forthcoming in Perspectives on Psychological Science. And with their permission, I'll summarise some of their responses here. So Evans and Stanovich argue that many of the objections to their views stem from misconceptions about the nature of the claims they're making. And they use their paper to clarify what they are and are not claiming. First of all, they acknowledge that some of the misconceptions stem from their use of the term system, and they drop that term. They try to restate their position without using it. And here are some of the points they make. First, they do not claim that there are two unified systems. As I said, they drop talk of dual systems and instead distinguish two types of processing, type 1 and type 2. And they allow that there may be multiple systems supporting each type of processing. So, for example, type 1 processors might include peripheral modules, Darwinian central modules, implicit learning processors, rules learned to automaticity, and so on. And they also allow that there may be different kinds of type 2 processors. So they reject the idea that the two systems are unified. Second, they accept that some differences, for example, fast versus slow, holistic versus analytic, are continuous. What they do is they distinguish modes of processing, cognitive styles, thinking dispositions, within type 2 thinking. And they argue that continuous differences are differences in the mode of type 2 thinking. Third, they accept that the dichotomies do not align perfectly, and that there can be hybrid processes, for example, rule-based and contextualized, or autonomous and rule-based, or contextualized and normative. Most of the features that are typically ascribed to the two systems, or two types of processes, they say are incidental correlates, not defining features. So they're typical features, but not necessary and sufficient ones. So, for example, type 2 thinking is typically slow, typically normative, and so on, but not necessarily so. And fourth, they accept that the two types of process interact via a default interventionist architecture. The idea is that type 1 processors generate a default response to a problem which will be acted on unless it's intervened upon by type 2 processors. And they also accept that there can be transfer of tasks between the processors, between type 1 and type 2 processors, through a process of automatization. And in addition, Evans stresses the role of pre-attentive type 1 processors in supplying content to type 2 thinking. So there's a lot of interaction going on between these two types of processing. And fifth, Evans and Stanovich do accept that they're committed to some degree of neural discreteness, but they don't say a lot about that. I think that's still very much an open area. Okay, so where does this leave us? Are we just back to the earlier picture where we have lots of independent dual process distinctions? Well, no. Evans and Stanovich think that there is a fundamental division in the human mind. They think that cognitive processes can be divided cleanly into two broad types, different characteristics and possibly different evolutionary histories. And they think of these two types of processes as constituting two minds. Evans calls them the intuitive mind and the reflective mind, or sometimes the old mind and the new mind. But how do we define these types? I said that Evans and Stanovich accept that many of the properties usually assigned to the two systems are only incidental ones, and they accept that there can be hybrid processes which mix and match these properties. But if there really is a clear distinction here, then there must be some properties that are not incidental, but core ones that are necessary and sufficient for belonging to one type or the other. And in trying to identify these core properties, we are really trying to get to the heart of the dual system distinction. So what do Evans and Stanovich think are the core properties of type 1 and type 2 processors? On type 1 processors, they agree that the core properties are autonomy and no use of working memory. The idea is that the operation of these processors is mandatory in the presence of the triggering stimuli, and that they don't require controlled attention. On type 2 processors, they have slightly different views, though they're complementary. Evans stresses the use of working memory. Working memory is a general purpose system that's involved in many higher cognitive functions, and the idea is that type 2 reasoning processors are just those reasoning processors that employ it. There may be other processors that involve working memory too, but type 2 reasoning processors are the ones that load on working memory. Stanovich stresses what he calls cognitive decoupling. That's the creation and manipulation of secondary representations which are decoupled from the world and which can be manipulated without contaminating our primary representations of how the world actually is. So these sort of representations permit hypothetical reasoning. These views are, and so what's central to type 2 thinking is that it involves cognitive decoupling. And this view is compatible with Evans's view, since Stanovich holds that cognitive decoupling requires attentional resources and the use of working memory. Now, I don't really disagree with Evans and Stanovich on this. I think the features they highlight probably are necessary and perhaps sufficient characteristics of the two types of thinking. But I don't think they go right to the heart of the distinction between type 1 and type 2 reasoning. And I want to propose a slightly different, though again complementary, view. Okay, so here's another view of what's at the heart of the two systems distinction. It's a view I've defended in various places, and it's inspired in part by suggestions by Daniel Dennett. The idea is that type 2 reasoning is a personal intentional activity. In saying it's a personal activity, I mean it's something we do. The activities involved are properly ascribed to the person as a whole rather than to subsystems of the person. Singing is a personal activity, pumping blood is not. It's an activity of a subsystem, the heart. In saying that type 2 reasoning is intentional, I mean that it's responsive to our beliefs and desires. We engage in type 2 thinking because we believe that it will help us get things we want. Typically solutions to problems or enhanced self-control. Type 1 reasoning, on the other hand, is not a personal activity in this sense, a personal intentional activity in this sense. So that's the idea. That's what I'm suggesting is at the heart of the type 1, type 2 distinction. Let's try to flesh that out a little. So what sort of activity is type 2 thinking on this view? Well, here's the idea. The actions involved are usually covert ones we perform in our heads, though some can be thought of as internalized versions of overt activities. And they involve the formation and manipulation of mental imagery. Imagery of various kinds, but in particular articulatory and auditory images of utterances, inner speech. Note that I'm assuming here that we can intentionally generate mental imagery. I think that's very plausible, and one way, perhaps not the only way, that we can do this, that we can generate mental imagery, is through the mental rehearsal of action. This is an idea that Peter Carruthers has developed in several places. The idea is that when we perform an action, an internal efference copy of the motor commands is created, which then generates sensory imagery of the movements involved. This imagery is used to guide the execution of the action and anticipate its effects. And the idea is that action schemata can also be activated offline with the commands to the muscles suppressed, but the efference copies and resulting sensory imagery still generated. And this allows us to mentally rehearse actions and assess their desirability, and also thereby to intentionally generate mental imagery. And this is particularly relevant, I think, to the generation of inner speech. Inner speech, I suggest, is just the mental rehearsal of utterances, generating articulatory and then auditory images. But how does that constitute thinking? I'm suggesting that doing this is a kind of thinking, type 2 thinking. But how can producing mental images be a reasoning process? Well, the idea is that mental imagery can act as what Dan Dennett calls self-stimulation. The imagery feeds back to our cognitive subsystems, often with beneficial results. Again, Peter Carruthers has developed this idea. The key notion is that of global broadcast. When we attend to sensory information, it is broadcast to all our cognitive subsystems, the autonomous subsystems that carry out type 1 processing, Darwinian modules, associative learning, etc. And these type 1 subsystems then process the information according to their particular specialisms, drawing inferences, forming memories, producing emotional responses, and so on. And mental imagery can also be broadcast and processed in this way, when it's attended to, and again producing various cognitive and motivational effects. So, when we mentally rehearse an action, this generates conditional beliefs about what would happen if the action were performed, and it triggers emotional and motivational responses to the effects of the action. And this enables us to evaluate an action prior to performance and decide whether or not to perform it. Now, we can harness this process of imagery production and global broadcast for the purposes of problem solving and self-control. Focus on inner speech in particular. The idea is that images of utterances are received and processed by the language comprehension system, which attaches a semantic content to them, just as it does to heard utterances. And this content will then be globally broadcast to other Type 1, to all the suite of Type 1 systems, which in turn will produce cognitive and motivational responses. For example, rehearsed statements will be evaluated for plausibility, their implications, coherence with existing beliefs, and so on. Rehearsed questions may prompt Type 1 subsystems to supply an answer that may be articulated in a further act of utterance rehearsal. Rehearsed instructions may stimulate motivational systems to execute the instruction. And in these ways, self-stimulation can help us evaluate hypotheses, retrieve information, and focus on goals. And in particular, note that an image may stimulate Type 1 systems to generate a further image, and so on, in cycles, producing sequences of imagery and self-stimulation. Now, these sequences will often be associative. One image may just call up another image that's associated with it in some way. This is what we call daydreaming, I guess. But these sequences can also implement rules. Remember, the idea is that image production is an intentional action, or can be an intentional action, that's responsive to our beliefs and goals. So a rehearsed utterance may prompt the rehearsal of another semantically related utterance in line with our beliefs about what thought sequences are normatively warranted, and beliefs that we may have acquired through tuition or other cultural processes, perhaps through engaging in argumentation with our peers. So in this way we can use imagistic self-stimulation to construct arguments and derive conclusions from them in line with normative theories. So I'm suggesting that this process of imagistic self-stimulation provides us with a mechanism for hypothetical thinking, for information retrieval, for self-control, argument construction, and general purpose problem solving. And my proposal is that the core feature of Type 2 processing is that they all involve active, intentional, imagistic self-stimulation of this kind. So, well, that's the proposal. I'm running out of time, but I'll briefly mention some of the attractions of the proposal and also some consequences of it. Attractions. Well, I think one major attraction of this is that it explains how Type 2 thinking could be evolutionarily late and distinctively human. The development of Type 2 thinking would not have involved the emergence of significant new neural structures. Rather, it would involve assembling a sort of virtual system which piggybacks on Type 1 processors and uses components and capacities, mental rehearsal, speech, suite of Type 1 subsystems that originally evolved for other purposes. So it could be really very recent in evolutionary terms. And indeed cultural processes could have played a large role in its emergence, as Daniel Dennett proposes. Second attraction is that this proposal explains how Type 2 processes can be shaped by culture and explicit instruction, which is an important feature of most dual system or dual process type stories. Now, this just follows from the claim that they are actions, that Type 2 processes are actions. Actions can be modified by imitation, instruction, and self-regulation. We can learn to do new things in line with beliefs about how they should be done. The third attraction is that this view explains the correlated features of Type 2 processing, the typical but non-necessary features. So on this view, Type 2 processors will typically be slow because they involve cycles of Type 1 activity, cycles of image formation, self-stimulation, and Type 1 processing. They'll typically be serial. That's another feature that's That's usually ascribed to system 2 processors. They'll be serial because only one action can be rehearsed at a time. Only one utterance can be mentally rehearsed at a time, for example. And they will be conscious. Type 2 processors will typically be conscious because they involve global broadcasting of sensory imagery. It's generally agreed that information that's globally broadcast is conscious, but at least coextensive with the information that's conscious. A fourth attraction is that this account subsumes the other accounts of what the core features of Type 2 processors are, the accounts I mentioned earlier by Evans and Stanovich. So on this view, Type 2 processors will load on working memory because they involve attending to and manipulating sensory imagery. We can think of working memory as something like an executive system for directing attention and sustaining and manipulating imagery in the global workspace. That's a view that Carruthers in particular proposes. And Type 2 processing will also support cognitive decoupling and hypothetical thinking, since we're able to rehearse possible actions and speculative utterances that do not correspond to how we think the world actually is. So I think this view subsumes the other one, has many attractions, and I suggest it really gets to the heart of the two systems distinction. Before closing, I'll just briefly mention some consequences of this view. One consequence of this is that Type 2 processors are heavily dependent on, and indeed partially realized in, cycles of Type 1 processing. So these systems are not going to be are not distinct, but one is heavily dependent on the other. Second, potentially any and all Type 1 processors could be involved in an episode of Type 2 thinking. So there's not going to be, we're not going to find distinct neural structures involved in there. In fact, many of the same structures are going to be involved in both. A third consequence is that motor areas, and especially speech, are going to be heavily implicated in Type 2 thinking. And a fourth consequence is that at most Type 2 processors are going to constitute a sort of virtual system. If we do want to talk about systems, the most we can say is that they constitute a virtual system, not a neural system. We're not going to be able to detect the system in the brain. We're only going to be able to see it when we look at the activity of the brain on a much larger scale and look at the interactions between many different components, including working memory, but also other areas, as I mentioned, such as motor areas. Okay, so I shall leave it there. That's what I think gets to the heart of the dual systems distinction. I've also prepared a handout on this talk which contains some references and summaries, and I'll be posting that on my website, and the address for that will come up in a moment. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you again to Professor Viale and the Herbert Simon Society for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you.